we go. Human happiness is basically going to consist of the fulfillment, you could say both of our human nature in general, what we hold in common with all other human beings, but also our own distinct human nature, right? So I don't know, I just threw an example. Tom Brady perfects his individual nature by being the best quarterback he can possibly be. He's not the best philosophy professor. He's not the best doctor, because his nature dictates that, you know, his place in the world is, you know, on the gridiron of the football field. Whereas the perfection of someone else's nature is going to be, I'm going to become the best doctor. I'm going to become the best nurse. I'm going to be the best, you know, whatever it may be. So Aristotle makes, so if we're going to talk about the perfection or development of human nature, Aristotle is going to identify something distinct in human nature that separates us from other animals, that is going to be the thing that we need to perfect, right? In general, what is the defining attribute of human beings or human nature that separates us from other animals?
Speech.
Yeah. So now we're going back to Sapiens here, right? And what Sapiens has to say in many ways is consistent with what Aristotle has to say, and what many thinkers on this topic have had to say. So what separates us from other higher mammals? Speech, and what else? Two things that are connected.
Reason.
Yeah, so speech and reason. And Aristotle, throughout his writings and in the Politics, says we are what he calls the zoon logikon, right? Number one here, the zoon logikon. And zoon actually is where we get our word for zoo, and it just means animal, right? So we're a certain kind of animal. He recognizes that we're both distinct from other animals, but also part of a continuum of, you know, organic life on the planet. And we are, the root word for logikon is the Greek word logos, right? We talked about a rational account and things like that, which is also another aspect of the meaning of the word logos. But in this context, the word logos means speech and reason, because how does one reason? One reasons through, okay. Got it, Janae. One reasons through speech, right? Speech is the medium in which we think, in the same way that clay is the medium the artist used to make the sculpture. Words are the medium, the clay we use to have the capacity to think to begin with. So that's why, for example, speech and reason are these two things that are really intertwined. And we can give a lot of very fancy definitions of what it means to reason. But when he uses the word reason, I mean, he just means we have the capacity to think in language. Reasoning is just thinking through something, or he's going to use words like reflection and deliberation. So what are we? We're the deliberating animal because we're the speaking and reasoning animal. Any thoughts about what does it mean to deliberate? And it's interesting, we can deliberate individually with ourselves alone, or we can deliberate with other people. What does it mean to deliberate?
Like debate and reason. So
yeah. Wow. So what is that? Is perfect. It's a kind of a discussion in which you debate and kind of weigh the pros and cons of, say, various courses of action. You know, we said that, you know, one of the things that language, going back to Sapiens, one of the things language provides is the ability to make choices. And deliberation and reflection is the process of thought that precedes making a choice. And once a choice is made, then you take an action based on the choice, right? So we can deliberate with ourselves. We can kind of, in our own mind, have a kind of dialogue with ourselves and weigh the pros and cons of given courses of action. Or we can deliberate with our friends. We can deliberate with our fellow citizens about the best course of action, whether we're in a family, whether we're in a polis, whatever it is. What's interesting, in book 3, Aristotle is going to say that the very essence of what a citizen is, a member of the political community functioning as a member of that community, right? Because we have a slightly different notion of citizen from Aristotle, from us to Aristotle. He says the kind of essence of a citizen is one who deliberates on behalf of the polis or on behalf of the political community. And that deliberation, well, when citizens deliberate, what might they be deliberating about? When citizens deliberate as citizens, okay, Sharika, laws. There's something really interesting about Aristotle's definition of citizen that is, in one sense, very different from our own. For Aristotle, to be a citizen and to act as a citizen is to participate in the public life of the community, not just to live there and say, have a birth certificate, that says you were born in the United States. For us, being a citizen is just a legal category that identifies your legal status within the country. And of course, that was true for Aristotle's time too. It was a legal status. But to be a citizen really meant for the ancient Greeks, you think of the pure democracy, the direct democracy that Athens had, where Aristotle spent much of his life. To be a citizen meant to be a participator in politics, and it meant to primarily to make laws. And being a citizen was one who ruled through making laws, right? For in our country, because we have this certain form of government that's in some ways noticeably different from anything Aristotle envisioned or saw in the city-state, we only have a very select group of people out of the 330 million, whatever number exactly we have in our country, only a very select number. In Washington, D.C., there's, between the senators and the congressmen and the president, there's like, 536 people who are part of that government. I guess you include 9 Supreme Court. And of course, there's a lot more people, but in terms of like elected officials, directly elected. So we have an indirect democracy. And for us, the duties of being a citizen simply involve, voting, but of course, that's not an obligation. Maybe going to war, and what else? Paying taxes, right? These very kind of minimal status of what it means to be a citizen in our country. Whereas for Aristotle, to be a citizen meant participating in the public life and therefore shaping the way of life of the city. And that this was one of the highest functions of the human being, to participate and shape the way of life of their city or their city-state, their polis, by making laws. Because what do laws do? They are enacted under some opinion of the happiness of the community, that and they say, do this, don't do that. And the idea is, if you do this and don't do that, it's going to contribute to the overall happiness of the community. And what are you doing in having laws? You're actually shaping the conduct of the community, which is to say, you're actually shaping the way of life of the community. Okay, so you start to see how being the rational animal or the speaking animal is actually connected to being a political animal. Because if being a political animal is being a citizen and a full participant in the public rather than the private life of your community, participating in the public life of the community involves what? It involves deliberating over the direction and the way of life of the community. Okay, let me scroll down here. and I'll come back to some of these things. So Aristotle is trying to get an idea in the politics, very simply, of what politics is and what the polis is, because politics for him really just means the business of the polis, or things that pertain to the political, the life of the community. Question: when we in our society, just like in ancient Greece, we make a distinction between the public realm and the private realm. Like there are certain things, we live a private life that is away from politics in many ways. It's away from, the reach of, certain laws. We believe that, for example, like morality should not be legislated, that there's a distinction between moral codes and political laws and so on. So some issues in our lives are private issues, and some issues in our lives turn out to be public or political issues. Does anyone have a thought about what distinguishes a public issue from a private issue?
I do.
Go for it. I don't think it's an easy question. So if you've got an answer, great.
In today's world, private issues are like health, your personal health care, or anything that requires like some type of permission to share. Do you get what I'm saying? Political deals with policies and a lot of other things that could be brought up to attention of people in higher power.
I think you're on the right track. You gave a very interesting example of a private issue, which was healthcare, and we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that because you kind of stepped in something very interesting there, right? Pertaining to our world right now. So political issues, we can say a private issue affects you and it's your business. It's not anybody else's. But as we know, political issues affect how many people?
Everyone.
Yeah. So this isn't it. So first of all, there's this famous expression, feminist from the 60s saying the personal is the political. And what she's kind of saying is the private realm is or can be the subject of political debate. And of course, one thing she was talking about was the protection of her own body, the right to control her own body, things like abortion. And so you would think that the right to direct your own body and do with it what you want would be a private issue. But then you realize that there's all types of public beliefs about what you should and shouldn't do. And you realize that it's actually a political issue because it's a concern of most of the people or many of the people, or it's a concern of the policymakers. And let's just say that the boundary between public and private is definitely not absolute, and it fluctuates over time. And a lot of it has to do with the time and place of what people have decided to take up as a public issue and say that, for example, that we need to legislate it versus simply just let people do whatever they want in the private sphere. There was a day where people smoked. Actually, there was all kinds of drugs going back to like the late 19th, early 20th century that were not, for example, regulated by the government at all. And it's like, it just wasn't under their purview to consider them issues of public legislation. And then at a certain point, they started realizing the public health effects of certain drugs. You take, for example, I think, did I say smoking? Like, so smoking, there were never rules about smoking. People used to smoke everywhere. Even in my own lifetime. I remember a day where, first of all, you had, cigarette, machines where you could buy cigarettes. They were everywhere. They were at the gas station. They were in the grocery store, and a pack of smokes cost like $1. And you would go and like put your money in and pull the thing, and the pack of smokes would come out. Yeah, there were candied cigarettes, but those aren't real cigarettes. I guess they still make candied cigarettes too. When I was little, I had candied cigarettes, but I never had real ones.
They do. It's just harder to find.
Yeah. So anyway, you guys you're not even aware of it in your lifetime because all these, the pervasiveness of cigarette. I'm sure you know people who smoke, or maybe you have a smoke when you have a beer or something. If you happen to do that, but like the public existence of smoking has totally transformed. People used to smoke everywhere, doctors' offices, hospitals, people smoked. It's just what it did. And, the public health pressure, and for good reasons, over a series of decades, it's a political issue and we need to legislate it. Now, the interesting thing, Nefertiti just mentioned one's personal health decisions. And I would say, absolutely, we're in a moment where obviously the issue of COVID and the vaccine has transformed something that typically has been treated as a private personal decision and now become a major decision of public policy. Ironically, all the mandates that are compelling people to get vaccinated are not being done by legislatures, which legislators are the ultimate bodies that deliberate, make the laws. And what do? They are the representatives of the people who express the will and opinion of the people. And notice that I don't think there's any legislature across the country that's ever legislated anything about the vaccine. It's been done by school systems. It's been done by CDC mandates. It's been done by government, governor mandates and whatnot. Mohammed, okay. So there's an issue that in typical times is a private issue that it now has become a public issue. Absolutely. Okay, so Aristotle says, if I want to understand what the polis is and its political life, the life that affects most of the people, I need to look at the nature of the thing. He says this in the first paragraph of the Politics, right? And so he has a specific meaning of nature. And let's just kind of go through some of these things, and then we'll get to the text and read some vital passages, and we'll call it a night. But the Greek word for nature is physis, and that's where we get our word physics. And the Greeks are credited with the first people intellectually to posit a notion of the natural world, that it functions on basic laws that can be known through the senses and through the use of our reason and understood, right? So the natural philosophers in ancient Greece, instead of accepting, for example, the religious explanations that when there's thunder, it's Zeus throwing a lightning bolt and stuff like that, they said, no, these are natural forces, which is to say physical forces that we can understand by observation and the use of our reason, and that nature functions on a fixed set of laws of cause and effect, and that we can understand how the physical world works. So physis, the physical world, physics, it functions on laws of cause and effects that are fixed and eternal and can be grasped by reason. Really important. So as we said here, number 4, the nature of a thing is something like its permanent or fixed essence, in contradistinction to an accident. And, oh, I'm sorry. But he says nature with a living thing is something slightly more than that. And this is going to be really important to understand Aristotle's concept of happiness next week. He says physis, the nature of a thing, is connected with its process of development, its growth, its birth, its life cycle. And in particular, he says that the nature of a thing is associated with its peak development, right? And I think the simplest model is like, I don't know, take an athlete, right? So an athlete is born, they're very far from the full development of their capacities. They become a teenager. They start realizing they're like a young adult, and they're starting to be able to do some of the things they'll later be able to do and like a professional athlete. And then sometime between 20 and 30, depending on the sport. You know, most athletes reach like their peak of physical condition, their peak skills, and so on and so forth. And then after that, it's all downhill, right? And how do we know that? Because most athletes retire pretty darn young compared to most other professions. So what is the nature of that athlete? It's when they hit their peak, right? It's at the state of like excellence. And he says that the nature of everything has these different components. So Aristotle sees things, everything in the world or everything in the cosmos in terms of purposes, or what's called a final cause. And the Greek word here that's important is everything has a telos. And a telos is another word for an end or a goal or a purpose of a thing. So for example, stupid example, the telos of a knife is to cut. Why do you make a knife? Because you need it to function, to have the purpose of cutting stuff, right? Simple as that. So its telos is to cut. Connected with this, he talks about the concept of, these are fancy words. We don't, it's good to be exposed to them. So the ergon of a thing is its characteristic activity in light of its nature, right? Its arete, or its excellence or virtue, is when it does its characteristic thing well. Okay, so what the heck am I talking about? I think when you see an example, this will become a little clearer. So everything has a nature, and even things we make as human beings have a nature because we ascribe them a purpose. We design them consciously for certain goals and purposes, like a golf club or a tennis racket or a knife or, you know, a whisk or whatever it is, a frying pan, right? So the goal of the knife is to cut. Its characteristic activity is cutting. Now think about it. This is kind of silly, but it's important. I could take that knife and try to use it as a hammer, right? Let's say there's something sticking up and I flip the knife around and I take it and use the handle of the knife to hammer. Now I could do that, but the knife is not optimally designed to hammer something, although it might work depending on what it is, but its balance and its weight and its shape are not designed for hammering. So the thing it's going to do best, its characteristic activity, is cutting. The arete is the excellence or how good it does its job, right? And the Greek word arete is the word that we're going to see in translated in English as virtue. And when we typically think of someone who has virtue, we think of them in terms of having moral virtue, that they're a good human being, they have good character. But when Aristotle uses, and we'll see an important connection with this issue of moral virtue, but the Greek word for virtue simply means excellence. And excellence has to do with doing this characteristic activity well, right? Okay, now to come full circle. Human beings. And this isn't self-evident from the politics. So I'm just kind of throwing these questions out so we can see it. What's the goal of a human life? A telos is a goal or a purpose. What's the goal of human life? What's the goal of everybody's life? Even though we might have different definitions of it.
Define fulfillment.
Yeah, so fulfillment. And let's just call it what we typically call it, happiness, right? Happiness. Wait a second here. I need to sneak that. There we go. So happiness. What is the telos of human life? Happiness, right? Trickier question. Given what we are as human beings, what is our characteristic activity going to be, or what is it going to involve? What distinguishes it? This has to do with what distinguishes us from other animals. Nefertiti, you want to go for this one?
Yes, it's a characteristic is to learn, to share, to get educated, in some form of schooling and to work.
Okay, very good. And you know what? I think Aristotle would absolutely agree with everything. Let me just mute you because you got a lot of background noise there. Pardon me for doing that. I think Aristotle would agree with everything you said. But he would say more generally, and he's going to say this in the ethics, that our characteristic activity is to reason. And why is that? Because reason is the one distinct element of our nature that separates it from the natures of all other types of beings, all other types of animals. And in learning, in working, all the things you mentioned, all of those are going to involve the use of our reason in some way, shape, or form. And when we reason excellently with arete or just virtue, when we reason virtuously, what are we going to do? We're going to be able to achieve our goal, to achieve our happiness. Okay, good. So what's the argument? We're going to fulfill our highest potential. Nicole, absolutely. So let me just kind of cut to the chase here, and then we'll read a few passages. Why is the polis so important? What is special about it that connects with our nature? Because we're not just a social animal, we're a political animal. What he's really saying is we're an animal of the polis. We belong, and this is his argument. We can agree or disagree with it, but we want to understand what he's saying first. He's saying we're the animal of the polis. We as a human being, given what we are, given our nature, we belong. We need the polis for certain things. Anybody have a thought about what the polis is going to give us that the other communities don't give us, that we need?
I'll take a shot. Well, what I was getting from the text is that in some of like the simpler, I guess, communities, like the households and the villages and stuff, like we can reach our immediate needs, our needs, our individual needs, but the polis is how we can get sort of different needs met, like how we're able to like leisure time or things so that we can develop and reach our highest potential, where we can't get that when we're just seeking our physical needs or everyday needs.
Okay, great. Let me just mention, so Sharika mentions a sense of belonging. And, one reason I teach this little writing in this little excerpt anyway, in this class, is traditionally the polis has been a kind of image of this ideal small community where people have a genuine sense of belonging and where it seems like a real community. In the modern world, we have families, but once we get back past the family, it is very hard in the modern world because of the structure of our world and because of the scale of our world. And this has been written about for a few hundred years now, going back to the 18th century, some of the problems of the modern world in having a sense of belonging to something more than just your family, right? And one of the reasons we're reading about the polis here is that the polis historically has always been looked at in a kind of romantic, maybe an overly romantic lens, as a community where people develop this intense sense of belonging and they feel like they're participating in something more than just themselves. They feel like they're participating in something more than just their family, and that they're not just an individual as a citizen, but they're a component of the larger community. And what matters is their participation in the larger community. In our world, there are different institutions like, churches and synagogues, and, various types of like civic institutions we might get involved in on a kind of neighborhood level. But it's really hard in our world to kind of get connected out there beyond a kind of family and friend existence. The polis kind of does it. Okay, so Nicole really kind of hit it on the head here. And I want to come back to what she said. She said the earlier communities satisfy certain basic needs, the needs of living simply or the needs of mere life. And what's another name for those needs? Those are the plural of telos is the teloi. Those are the teloi of those different communities, right? Maybe we should just do this now before we read and clarify this. If I can find.
Was that like the remember was it Hobbes who talked about the conservation? Would those be conservation needs then, like the physical needs?
Oh yeah, Aristotle. Hobbes totally copies Aristotle in this because I think it's kind of just right. He says the two functions of society are conservation and delectation. Right? Isn't that the word he used? Delectation?
Yeah, like pleasure, like
Yes.
stuff that's
So
outside of what we need,
so
basically.
he purposely doesn't use the word happiness for various reasons, but his word delectation is a kind of substitute for happiness. And Hobbes is kind of like a materialist, like he's really rooted in kind of the modern scientific physical world, whereas happiness really has to do ultimately for the Greeks, it's the goods of the soul rather than the goods of the body that matter. Like, for example, Aristotle's going to say things in the ethics like money is not unimportant, obviously, but he's going to say something like money is not an end in itself. The goal of life is not to make money. The goal of life is simply to have enough money to satisfy higher needs that are ultimately the needs of the soul. And Hobbes, being a kind of materialist, he says the two goals in life, the mere life is preservation. That means survival, right? That's just another word for survival. Or he says conservation, but he means like self-preservation. And then he says delectation. And once you're living and you don't have the fear of death hanging over you, then you have physical pleasure, right? Aristotle is going to be concerned with happiness in terms of the pleasures of the soul rather than the pleasures of the body. And of course, delectation is an ambiguous word because I suppose primarily it refers to pleasures of the body, but it could also refer to other pleasures as well, the ones Aristotle would include.
Okay.
And
Is it gonna be covering the hierarchy of souls? Is that what we're gonna be covering next book? Like the three levels of the soul?
yeah, so we'll get into.
Yeah, I don't need to jump ahead. I was
Yeah,
just curious if that's where you were going with it.
yes, because we don't want to get ahead because we'll confuse people, but the Greeks posit that there are these three parts of the soul that have different motivational sources and they desire different things. And our concept of happiness is going to be connected with those three parts of the soul. And we'll see those next week. Okay.
Okay, cool. Thank
So,
you.
so the big thing here is that each of these four communities satisfies different needs. And another way of saying that they satisfy different needs is to say that they have different purposes or different functions, or each has its own distinct telos. A telos is an end. And by end, we don't mean exactly like the end of life or the end of the movie. We mean like it's a goal or it's a target or it's an aim it's something we're aiming for. Our end is our destination. And for Aristotle, you have means on the one hand and you have ends on the other. A means is an instrument you use to achieve an end, and an end is just a goal. And so I apologize right now because Aristotle's got all this kind of technical language. And once you actually understand what he's saying, it becomes pretty transparent and very intelligible. But when you first enter Aristotle's lingo, it's a little bit daunting. So each of these communities has a different purpose or goal. And so right now, let's just answer what they are. What is the function or the purpose of the couple, male and female? What's their reason for being?
To have an offspring, yeah.
Yeah, to reproduce. Why do they need to reproduce?
For the survival of the species or to pass down their genetics, like yeah.
So he mentioned some couple interesting different reasons, but the primary one is, human beings are mortal. Their life cycle is finite, And the only way we can perpetuate ourselves and continue to quote unquote live beyond the grave is to produce offspring. And so in any community, we take all this for granted, right? Today, all the talk is about there's too many people on the planet, got to provide more what they call women's health services, which really means abortion, which is, they never used to call it that until the last 5-6 years or so. And so our problem is we've got, so they say, like Bill Gates, we've got too many people on the planet because we've been too successful at procreation because of the developments of technology and healthcare in the last 150 years, basically. And food, production of food, cheap food. But of course, for most of human history, you do not have community unless you have procreation. And procreation is no guarantee, it's not guaranteed the way it seems to be with us anyway. Good. So the primary function of the couple is to produce children. Very simple. And of course, this he's claiming is the nature of this social unit, which he calls the male and the female. Eventually it's man and woman, right? So you notice this transition from the couple to the household, they go from male and female to man and woman. We might add that these first three communities are, he would call them, he doesn't use the word, but we could call them social. And it's when we get to the polis that it's a political community as opposed to just a social unit. And it has to do with the needs that are satisfied. That seems to be the real distinction. And Nicole alluded to it, that there's something distinct about what the polis makes possible for these people. What's the function of the household? What is its purpose? What is its telos?
Like everyday needs of,
Okay,
of the
good.
family.
So and notice he qualifies it with this issue of a temporal element, everyday needs. We said this at the beginning of class, and this is a brilliant, vital observation of Aristotle. Why do human beings come together into social units at all? Why are we the social animal? Because we have what?
We have needs that we can't get on our own.
Yes, we have needs that we can't satisfy under our own powers. And the word that you would use, we're not
Self-sufficient.
self-sufficient. And this is a really funny thing about the way nature, quote unquote, designed us. It gave us needs that are essentially greater than our ability to satisfy them on our own. So we can only satisfy these needs, or at least only satisfy them effectively and conveniently, by coming together in social units. The first three, notice, are all connected by the family and by biology, right? That's important. So he adds a temporal element. He says everyday needs. What kind of needs are we talking about? That the household, what these everyday needs? Are we talking about the needs of spiritual fulfillment?
Like sleeping comfortably, cleaning up after yourself, eating, and like
Yeah.
those are things that take work every day. So if you're passing it off to somebody else, you've got more time on your hands.
Yeah, and that's what he's getting at, particularly, and this is his argument to justify the Greek version of slavery, right? That it actually liberates people to do other things other than just satisfy the basic needs of life, right? So absolutely, these needs we're talking about are basically like the needs of immediate life, survival. We don't normally think of them in those terms, but the basic, and really they're needs of the body, right? And the household, this is interesting. The Greek word for the household is oikos. Actually, you can go and buy some Greek yogurt that I think is made by Dannon called oikos, and it means house or household. Actually, it's a household is important because it's not just the physical structure, it's the whole social system that operates within that structure. And for the Greeks, it was very well defined and kind of fixed for the most part. That the word economics is actually derived from the Greek word oikos. And in the politics, he calls economics, it's translated as household management. Because what is economics all about? It's about the production and exchange of goods that serve the needs of mere life, basic survival, right? Hence economics. And in the Greek world, it wasn't exclusively, but primarily the idea was that the division of labor within your household between man and woman and master and slave provides for all the basic needs, and that the household is largely economically self-sufficient, which is to say it produces a lot of different things. Okay, good. So the village, first of all, what is a village made of?
It's basically so there's the families, and then that becomes like the household, and so like many households would kind of be a village, and sort of it would be like one head of the house, and then the village would be like the intimate blood relatives.
Yeah. So number one, the village, let's be clear. So the village is many households, right? And not only are they many households, but they're all biologically related. They're all cousins and uncles and grandparents and grandchildren and so on and so forth. So they're bound together by blood. What unites them and what defines their like their moral compass, the rules of the village, they come from the same ancestors. And
Traditions.
one thing we're going to see is that the village is a traditional community. So now we're going back to things that we saw in Mending Wall, where you've got this traditional character and the questioning character who's questioning tradition and wants to know whether the tradition is reasonable or not. Like, okay, you've got a wall there and you say it's good because your daddy says that, but now explain to me rationally what justifies the wall. And if you can explain it to me rationally and give reasons as to why it's the right thing to do, maybe I'll accept it, despite the fact that something there is that doesn't love that wall so much. Maybe I can be convinced of it. So the village is some kind of it's a traditional community that follows the traditions handed down from one generation to the next. And that's really crucial, because where does it get its moral orientation? Or where does it get the orientation of its rules? Well, it talks about the significance of like the patriarch, the male ruler of the household, who really sets the laws, quote unquote, for his household. And then as you get to the village level, you probably get village elders, males, who take dominant roles, who are in large part simply following the precedents of their ancestors. And why do you do that? Because you have respect for your ancestors and you follow what they did, because that's by definition in a traditional society, that's the right thing to do. Okay, what kind of needs are satisfied in the village?
Wouldn't those be like I think they said the long-term needs that are not everyday needs?
Yeah, so Aristotle words it in a very awkward way that is not very helpful. He
Yeah.
says needs other than every day. Needs other than every day. And you're like, what the hell is he talking about? Well, first of all, I think he's talking about the same kind of physical needs that the household provides, in the sense that they're a category of needs, which is to say their needs still dealing with the physical well-being of the people rather than the psychological well-being of the people, right? Obviously, physical well-being does produce psychological well-being, but it's not primarily directed to that. So you can imagine in a village that they discover that there are longer term needs that they need to plan for and to use. So the important thing here is, remember what our characteristic activity is. It's the use of our reason, right? It's the use of our reason. In procreation, Aristotle makes an important point. He says, procreation is not done by deliberative choice. So there's that word deliberation. And choices are the result of thinking and deliberation. And he says procreation, if procreation is not done by deliberation and choice, what is it done by?
Biology and nature.
Yeah, instinct, impulse. It's nature's control over us. We have no choice in it. It's just sheer necessity and impulses at work. When we get to the household, we have to satisfy everyday needs. And how do we do that? We probably start using our reason to consider how best to meet those needs. So we use reason in terms of thinking about how to solve everyday problems. It's really quite elegant and not simplistic, but simple in a streamlined kind of elegant way. Then we get to long-term needs. And so what are we using? We're still calculating with instrumental reason, like we have desires of the body, needs of the body that need to be satisfied. We're going to use reason as a tool to solve those problems. Hence this expression, instrumental reason. Because reason is not trying to determine what the needs are. The needs are given by our bodies: sleep, food, warmth, etc., etc. The interesting thing here is we're thinking about the future and how we're going to approach it, rather than simply being in the moment of solving everyday needs. That seems to be the difference here, what he seems to be talking about.
Can I ask a
Remember,
question, Professor?
yes.
Just because I want to make sure I understand. So would like a long-term need be like farming to basically have?
Yeah, so
Okay.
this raises an interesting question of what he's actually talking about. But the things I can think of are things that are not immediate problems today, but could be immediate problems down the road, right? It's like today we have food, but how are we going to guarantee food tomorrow when it's winter and we don't have crops to grow? So we need to plan today to be prepared for tomorrow. So it could be things like absolutely farming. We plant crops here, we harvest them in the fall, and then we don't just eat them all then. We preserve some crops for the season where we don't have any crop production. Could be things like, I don't know, we've discovered that we have enemies and we need to build walls around our village to protect us. Today, there's no enemy coming to kill us, but we start to realize that there's a threat from some tribe over there. So the people in the village are living a kind of tribal existence, right? A tribe is literally a village, a grouping of many families, right? That's literally what a tribe is, a big extended family, or another word for it is a clan, right? So I think it's open to interpretation what could be talked about. I think it could be any number of things. I think it's just things that they don't seem like obvious problems today, but we realize based on some experience that they could be problems in the future. And therefore, we're going to solve those problems today before they arrive so that they don't become an actual problem for us. Something like that.
Okay. Thank you.
And what does that involve? It involves the whole village working collectively together to solve only problems that the collective can do effectively, right? So maybe they have to come together to fight other people. Much less effective if they're trying to do that individually as households, right? If they unify and, work collectively, and I don't know, maybe they need to, stay in shape or work on their martial skills, a few days a week, things like that. Right. In ancient Greece, for example, basically everybody was potential to play some role in the military when there was war, because unlike our situation with a fortress America, a war was an existential threat to these people. Their whole city could be overrun. The men get murdered. The women get taken as wives, and the children get re-educated, and all kinds of
Right.
awful things could happen, which you don't want to have happen.
So it's basically how to secure the security if a strike should arise or anything like that would be a long-term
Yeah,
need.
yeah. And since he doesn't say anything, you just have to kind of speculate. Okay, so the big thing about the polis is reason is used in a new and special way. And it's connected with what? Deliberation over what our laws and what our way of life is going to be. In the previous instances, either reason is not used at all, procreation is just impulse, and the others involve situations in which the goal is already determined, right? We need to survive. We're just going to use our intelligence as human beings to best achieve that goal. The interesting thing about the polis, it raises the question of how do we want to live? What is the way of life that's best for us? And we're going to deliberate over it. We're going to think about it. It's going to be a question. So now we're using reason not just as a means to achieve an end, but we're using reason to think about what our ends, what our teloi, what our goals should actually be. You think about Afghanistan, the government gets together. We want security for the country, but what should we actually do? Should we stay in Afghanistan? Should we leave Afghanistan? Blah, 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 and on and on. So every community of human beings know one thing. They all know they want to be happy. The question is, what does that actually look like in its details, right? That's the real challenge. And each community is going to come up with a different set of answers and therefore a different set of laws to manifest their conception of happiness. But here we're using, when we're reasoning in the polis, we're literally having legislators come together as citizens or as legislators, because it's really the same thing, deliberating over how we want to live our life, right? I mean, this is what is America? It's an experiment in self-government. Self-government means we decide how we are going to govern ourselves. And what does that really mean? It means we're going to decide how we want to live as a people, right? We actually have a say. And not only do we have to have a say, but we have to sit and debate it, right? This is, for example, why the First Amendment is so important. The freedom to actually have, to articulate one's opinion about the direction of one's own life, ultimately. Because whatever is legislated, well, that's obviously compels you to act in a certain way. You have to follow the laws, right? Simple as that. So I want to turn to read a couple passages. Any thoughts, questions, or comments here? Okay, I don't have it here. That's why, because it's on the other thing. 1 second. Okay. Who would like to read for us?
I'll read.
Who's that?
Sharika.
Sharika, wonderful. You want to start with the beginning here? Chapter 1, we see that every city-state?
Sure. We see that every city-state is a community of some sort, and that every community is established for the sake of some good, for everyone performs every action for the sake of what it takes to be good. Clearly then, while every community aims at some good, the community that has the most authority of all and encompasses all the other aims highest. That is to say, at the good that has the most authority of all, this community is the one called a city-state, the community that is political.
Okay, great. So the city-state is just the city or the polis, right? He says so much here without saying it. It's all very schematic, right? He says, we see that every polis is a community of some sort. Well, the couple is a community of some sort. The household is a community of some sort. The village is a community of some sort. And what he wants to get at in the politics is what sort of community is a polis really, right? First of all, what is a community? What is a community?
A group of people with common interests.
Okay, good. Whenever we think of like a nation or a city or a town or whatever it is, we think of the geographical boundaries. Oh yeah, New York is this, right? The Bronx is here, Brooklyn here, right? And we say, well, that's a community. It's like those boundaries. Aristotle really, I mean, obviously geographical proximity plays a very important role in community because it means you're around other people and you get familiar with them. Except in New York, where there's so many freaking people, you can't possibly, everybody looks like a stranger. Everybody's a stranger on the street. It's a very unusual place. But a community is not just about geography. It's bound by what people hold in common, including, you could say, yes, their interests. I think that's a great word for it. And particularly, we might even say their conception of happiness, right? What binds those people together is not just that they live in the same place, but they're bound together by common principle. Got it, Nicole. By common principles and a common way of life that really is the glue that holds them together. Every community is established for the sake of some good, right? And by good, he means something that they deem necessary or needful, that's beneficial to them. And a good is just another way of talking about the telos. Each community comes together for some end, for some need, for some goal to be satisfied. And he says this, while every community aims at some good or some end, the community that has the most authority of all and encompasses all other aims highest and at a good that has the most authority. And the community and this community is the one called the polis, that is the political community. So for some reason, the political community, the polis, is the authoritative community because it aims at the authoritative good. What is the authoritative good of human life? What is, let's put it another way, what's the highest good of human life? What's the highest goal? We've actually already said it, just in different language.
To be happy.
Yes, happiness. What's his argument here? That the other forms satisfy the needs of mere life, but they don't satisfy the needs of happiness because those communities don't provide all the necessary, you could say, infrastructure, or don't provide the use of our reason in a certain way to create laws to legislate our way of life in accord with our opinion of happiness. So this starts to get at why the polis is special and distinct. So if we could go, I think if we go about 10 more minutes, we can pretty much get what we need to get here. Could you pick up
Chapter 2.
Sharika in chapter 2? Yep.
What's highlighted? Okay. If one were to see how these things develop naturally from the beginning, one would in this case, as in others, get the best view of them. First, then, those who cannot exist without each other necessarily form a couple, as I, female and male, do for the sake of procreation. They do not do so from deliberate choice, but like other animals and plants, because the urges to leave behind something of the same kind as themselves is natural. And as a natural ruler, and what is naturally ruled to do for the sake of survival. For if something is capable of rationale, foresight, it is a natural ruler and master. Whereas whatever can use its body to labor is ruled and is a natural slave. That is why the same thing is beneficial for both master and slave.
Okay. Interesting here, when he talks about slave, he's not necessarily talking about a human being. And we'll see that in a second. So he says, if one were to see, he's always this hypothetical, if one were to see how things develop naturally from the beginning. Well, what is he talking about here? He's talking about the nature of a thing. What did we say the nature, one aspect of the nature of a thing is? It's a process of development from the beginning, or from its birth to its peak of existence. It's kind of full flourishing or maturity, right? Here, however, we're not talking about the natural development of an individual. We're talking about what he sees as the natural development of the human community. And the foundation, the birth of the human community starts in male and female and their active procreation. And from there, it goes into a household, and from the household to the village, and to the village to the polis. And what is the polis? The polis is made up of many villages. And this is interesting because the polis is not made up of one extended family. Each village, I think the idea here is, and actually, if you learn some of the history of the ancient Greek city-state, all the citizens of, say, Athens lived in villages that were defined by their extended families. And they all had their, when you knew where they lived, you knew what family lineage they came from. And the point was that the village is kind of the extended family unit, but the polis consists of different groupings of different families that don't have the same heritage, right? So they're not all related by blood. They're not all family members. So public life is bound by a loyalty that's something other than blood. And that's really important, because the polis is a form of community that transcends the family relationship to what Aristotle sees as something even higher than the family, right? Okay. It's interesting that he says that male and female do not come together and act out of deliberate choice. I mean, obviously, it's biology, right? Why does he say that here? I think because when we get to the polis is going to determine how it lives based on exactly that, based on the use of its reason to deliberately choose how it lives, right? Even, living in your own family, you can get that sense of the lack of choice. Starting with, you don't choose your family, and you don't choose what they're like, and you don't choose your ancestors. And in a traditional society, all these things have incredibly defined the nature of your existence. The political life is going to be the one where we get together and say, you know what? We're actually going to talk about how we want to live for the first time, and decide it based on a public discourse or deliberation, right? And you can see how this ties into like notions of democracy and notions of self-government, as opposed to just, following the world that you've been born into and the traditions and the habits, and that's just going to be the way it is. So you can start to see why this polis or political life is considered so special and distinct. Okay. Sharika, if you could pick up this paragraph down here at the bottom of the page, the first thing to emerge from these two communities.
I'm sorry, where there's a natural distinction right there?
Right here. The first paragraph, the first thing to emerge.
The first thing to emerge from these two communities is a household, so that Hesiod is right. Hesiod is right when he said in his poem, first and foremost, a house, a wife, and an ox for the plow.
Okay, great. Yeah, for an ox is a poor man's servant. The poor man can't afford what? A human slave. He can only get an ox. He says the household is made of two communities. What are the two communities that the household is made of?
A wife.
Yeah, the couple, and what else?
Oh.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, so the couple and the master and the slave, and that those two go together. And what's the fun? I mean, we could have a whole extended discussion on the role of slavery here and his arguments on behalf, where he really stands in relationship to it. But for Aristotle, one of the problems of life is there's a lot of shit to be done every day. What's the problem? Think about the concept of everyday needs. It means every day you wake up, the needs that you satisfied yesterday, you have all over again. That's how I think about when I see my bed. I said, shit, I just made that thing. I don't want to make that again because I got to do it every day. I'll just leave it unmade. It's much better. Or doing the dishes. I just cleaned up, I just cleaned up those dishes. You get them dirty again because you got to eat. So our bodies are constantly generating these needs that they never get satisfied. So what's the issue? If we're ever going to have free time, at least in Aristotle's understanding, slavery allows for the liberation of people from the thrall of everyday needs, right? This is the logic of his argument. And of course, it's not racial slavery and Greeks enslaved Greeks. A lot of slavery in the ancient world had to do simply with military conquest. And of course, slavery was the status quo of the globe until, deep into the 18th and 19th century. And nobody had any problems with slavery until then. And until certain ideas emerged that, particularly the notion of human equality, which nobody accepted, that human beings were equal, really until the 19th century, the 18th century, anywhere in the globe. And every culture, every civilization was involved in slavery, one form or another, like everyone. And let's look at our lives. Let me be provocative. We don't have slaves, and what do we have to do 40 hours a week?
Work.
Yeah, we all have to work, which means we all have to do the things that the manual laborers would have done, right? So this is what we get for equality. It means everybody works rather than just some people. And what is the ox? The ox is a slave.
Poor man's slave.
Yeah, a poor man's slave. And how does Aristotle define a slave? An animate tool, a living tool to execute the purposes and needs of the master, right? Marx, he thought, he accepted a lot of these arguments about the use of our time that Aristotle makes in his justification for slavery. At least it's not the whole justification, it's part of it. And you can wonder what the extent to which Aristotle really is fully on board with slavery at all, because we're reading one little excerpt here. But Marx thought, Karl Marx, right, communism and everybody will be equal and we'll live in the utopia. He thought the machines would be the slaves of the modern world. And in some ways that's very true, because they perform all types of activities that we don't have to. And in other ways, it's not really come to pass in some ways at all. Okay, you want to keep going, Shakira? I'm sorry, Sharika.
Sharika, it's okay. The community naturally constituted to satisfy everyday needs then is the household. Its members are called meal sharers by Charondas,
Charondas
and manger sharers by Epimenides
the Cretan. Yep.
Epimenides the Cretans, with the first community constituted out of several households for the sake of satisfying needs other than everyday ones in a village.
Okay. Question?
No, I was just gonna keep reading.
It's a couple things. He says that people in a household are meal sharers and manger sharers. It's really funky, but this is actually really important. What does it mean when he says they're meal sharers and manger sharers?
Because everybody in the household you have to feed and you have to find some place for them to sleep.
And not just that they eat together and they sleep together. And we're not talking about necessarily sex here. We're just talking about sharing common space. This is going to be really important when Aristotle talks about friendship in the ethics. What happens when you eat together and sleep together with people?
Bond.
Yeah,
Strike a bond, yeah.
you get to see them in every situation, right? You get to see them when they're not on Facebook doing their beatific. You get to see the real them, right? And not only it's two things. You're spending time, lots of time, and you're spending time when they're not putting their best image forward. So you really know them. And by the same token, you're not in that other person's household, in the other household or the other village. So you don't know them as well, right? So this obviously speaks to obviously sleeping and eating is like the everyday needs. That's part of it. But it's also the solidarity that comes with family life, right? And so the interesting thing is the new solidarity that's going to be created in the polis is not sleeping and eating together, but deliberating together about how we're going to live our life. And politics is going to become like, breathing air, to what we do at home. And it's important to recognize that Aristotle didn't look at all nations or all kind of governmental structures as being political. For Aristotle, regimes are only political when they actually come together and engage in this kind of deliberation about how they're going to live their life. And you can think of many forms of government or forms of regime where there really is no collective reasoning about how they're going to live. There are just rulers who say, this is what it's going to be. Or there are rulers that say, this is the tradition. There's nothing to talk about because the tradition has spelled out how we're going to live. So let's just do it. Okay. You want to keep going, Sharika?
Sure. As a colony of offshoot from a household, a village seems to be particularly natural, consisting of what some have called sharers of the same milk. Sons and the sons of sons, that is why city-states were originally ruled by kings, as nations still are, for they are constituted out of people who were under kingships. For in every household, the eldest rule as a king, and so the same holds in the offshoots, because the villagers are blood relatives. This is the Homer is describing when he says, each one lays down the law for his own wives and children, for they were scattered about, and that is how people dwelt in the distant past. The reason all people say that the gods too are ruled by a king is that they themselves were ruled by kings in the distant past, and some still are. Human beings model the shapes of the gods on their own and do the same to their way of life as well.
Okay. So there's so many interesting things here. He talks about villages and nations. And it's interesting, he's using, if you look up the definition of what a nation is, it's actually a little different than you might think. We talk about the United States, we say it's a nation, blah, blah, blah. The word nation specifically involves a community that's bound together by some type of racial and ethnic commonalities, right? Same ancestors, same blood. The Germans talked about blood and soil. They all came from the same place and they all had the same ancestors, right? The nation is just a big version of a village, right? It's just a village writ large. It's a huge nation, really is a large family, right? Ruled by a king. And what does he say where the king comes from? It's the ruler of the male ruler of the household. And he's not ruling over just a household anymore, but villages or a whole nation of people, right? The big thing, he's talking about all these blood relationships, family relationships, same ancestors, is that the polis and the loyalty to the polis, the thing that binds the polis together is not going to be blood. It's going to be their vision the collective vision of what they are, what their identity is, what their conception of happiness is, that's not going to come from their ancestors. It's going to come from their own decisions through deliberating with one another. One really interesting little thing that said that people in a village are sharers of the same milk. What does that mean?
Came from the same place,
More specific.
same mother.
Yeah, same ancestor, right? When you trace it back. And I always tend to think that what's being said here is to be taken literally, but also figuratively. That on one hand, they come from the same female ancestor if you trace it back so many generations. But the other thing I think is being said is that they all, well, we might say they all drinking the same Kool-Aid. They all believe the same things. They all have the same traditional beliefs because they're all obliged. Where do the rules, where does the morality of a traditional society come from? It doesn't come from claiming this is how we're going to live and this is what we're going to do. It comes from tradition. Tradition is literally that which is handed down from one generation to the next. And it's not just, what we eat and what holidays we celebrate and how we do it. It's what we believe, what gods we believe, what gods we pray to, and how we live. What are our moral codes? So the moral codes in a traditional society, for the most part, are not up for debate, right? Actually, in a traditional society, to question the moral codes that have been given to you by your ancestors is like a transgression. It's a provocation. It's not something you're supposed to do, except maybe in a condition of emergency. The polis is going to be the one that's not traditional. It's going to bring the traditions before you, might say the tribunal of public reasoning, and say, is this a good tradition? I think we kind of just about wrap up because I know we got to go, but question, a silly question. Are traditions good or bad?
Depends, right?
Yeah, I would
Depends
say, you want to go?
Yes, go for it.
I would say it depends, like she said, like some traditions can be outdated based on like the society and the time frame that you live in. And some traditions, are like a food or like something that, will not affect people's lives, but some traditions can be outdated.
Yeah, I'll give you one example. It wasn't that long ago that Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden said, same-sex marriage? You've got to be kidding me. Marriage is between a man and a woman. And as things changed and public opinion evolved, they evolved with it. And they said, you know what? Same-sex marriage, great thing. Civil rights issue of our time. But they totally flip-flopped, like many other politicians on that issue over the course of the last 20 years. When it really,
That's true.
when the general public perception of it changed. And now nobody really even, I assume younger generation don't even bat an eyelash about it. Like, it's just the way it is. What do all traditions have going for them? That's actually, you might say traditions could be intrinsically positive. There's one little thing that they kind of have going for them.
They create a system.
Yeah, they create a system, and we might add one thing. They create a system that, however imperfect it may be, we know it works. Why? Because my father did it, and my father's father did it, and it stood the test of time. It stood the test of experience, right? What's the problem with innovating and thinking you can rationally divine what the right thing to do is? Well, you can have all those fancy ideas in your head, but if those are new ideas and they've never been tested, you have no real clue whether they're actually going to work, right? So there's this interesting kind of dialogue between using reason and using tradition to determine what the right way is. And both sides have their problems. For example, just very quickly, the French Revolution believed that it was going to take all traditions, every single one of them in French society and even European society, because they wanted to take the French Revolution across all of Europe. And they would say every tradition that we've had, every religious element, every political element, every moral element, we're going to bring it before what they the tribunal of reason. And reason will judge whether that tradition is good or bad. And if it's good, we'll have to produce reasons why it's good. One thing tradition doesn't have to do is give reasons other than say, well, it's a tradition, therefore it's good, right? And actually, the French Revolution was incredibly radical in kind of questioning everything, or as much as you might imagine is possible in a revolution. It was quite radical. Okay. And we could just go a couple more minutes. Where are we? Let's just pick up, if we could, Shrika, just 2 more minutes right here at this paragraph between numbers 5 and numbers 10. It is also clear why a human being is more of a political animal. So now this gets to the question of what is a political animal? And
It is also clear why a human being is more of a political animal than a bee or any other gregarious animal. Nature makes nothing pointlessly, as we say, and no animal has speech except a human being.
okay, so a political animal is an animal that's gregarious, or at least that's a big part of it. What does it mean to be gregarious?
Gregarious.
Be able to communicate.
Yes, talks, right? And he distinguishes here between humans and animals. Animals have voice. He obviously I mean, they communicate, there's no doubt about that, but human beings have speech. And so we can't rehash the whole thing now, but we talked when talking about sapiens, we talked about the distinction between what animals do when a dog barks, for example, or that monkey squeals that the lion is over there, versus what human beings are able to do when they speak. And it has to do with the symbolic nature of language that's different from what he calls voice here, to distinguish the two. Okay, you want to keep going, Shrika, and we'll call it a night?
Sorry, had my mute on. A voice is a signifier of what is a pleasant or painful, which is why it's also possessed by other animals. For their nature goes this far, they not only perceive what is pleasant or painful, but signify it to each other. But speech is for making clear what is beneficial or harmful, and hence also what is just or unjust. For it is peculiar to human beings in comparison to the other animals that they alone have perception of what is good or bad, just or unjust, and the rest. And it is community in these that makes a household and a city-state.
Okay, great. Let's clarify this last sentence. He says, and it is community in these that makes a household or a city-state. We said community is a group of people bound together by some glue that they hold in common. He says it is community in these. What is the these? That's a pronoun that refers to previous nouns. What is he talking about here? Community in what? What's the glue of the polis? What has he just been talking about in the previous 2 sentences? Speech makes clear not just pleasure and pain, but
It's unjust and just.
yes. And what are these concepts? Good, bad, just, and unjust. What kind of concepts are they?
It's right and wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're moral concepts.
Absolutely. How does he distinguish voice between speech? The animal's voice distinguishes pleasure and pain. So when, I don't know, the bird is happy, it sings. And when it's getting, when an animal is getting harmed, it squeals or barks in pain or something like that. Obviously, we have perceptions of pleasure and pain, but we don't simply code them we don't just give them names based on feeling good and feeling bad. We give them moral codings. we call this pleasure just and this pain unjust, and this pain just and this pleasure unjust, and so on and so forth. So this is not the only function of language for Aristotle, but in terms of the political function of language, for him, it's the characterizing of everything. You could say everything in human life in terms of good, bad, just, and unjust. How are we going to use our language to manifest this moral characterization or moral coding of the world? We're going to come together as citizens to deliberate about how we're going to live our lives. And I'm going to say, I think this is just, this thing. I code it, I call it, I name it just, and I think this is unjust. Therefore, we should have a law that is, promotes this, and a law that prohibits that. And then someone else is going to come along and say, what? You know what? I'm not sure I totally agree with you. And we're going to have this dispute, this deliberation. Remember, this whole notion of deliberation is not just some perfectly harmonious reaching of agreement about what's right and what's wrong. It's a dispute. Look at our politics. There are a lot of problems with our politics. And one of the problems is actually all the polarization, all the division. There are reasons why that is problematic. But one of the signs that it's actually healthy, all this disagreement, is that people are disagreeing with one another. And if they're disagreeing with one another, at least in an ideal world, it means they're actually expressing their point of view. They get to have their say, because it's only natural, because people are diverse by nature. People are different. They have different natures. They come from different circumstances. So therefore they don't agree on what happiness is, or what should be just and what should be unjust. And what are we going to do here in the polis? We're not going to rely on what our ancestors said and what our ancestor did, or at least not completely. We're going to use our own judgment, our own reasoning in the present. And we're going to have to, if we disagree with other people, what are we going to have to do?
Speak up,
Pardon?
talk about it, speak up.
And how specifically in politics do you talk to someone else who doesn't agree with you? What's the technique of speech that you use to try to get them to your point of view?
Debating.
Debate. And what's another word? It starts with a P.
Politicking.
Close.
Policy?
You're gonna persuade them.
Wait, okay.
Persuade them. And so let's just finish with this. I mean, one aspect of the human being as a rational animal is that we have the ability to choose, right? And to say that we have the ability to choose is to say that our very nature gives us a certain type of freedom that other animals don't have. We can live a deliberate existence where we consent or do not consent to certain courses of action, right? To consent is to choose. Like, I choose to sleep with you, or I choose not to. And since I'm a human being, this is the argument of why consent matters. Because we have the capacity to choose, our choice, our consent has to be respected under the premise of the moral equality of every human being, right? So what happens? Why is politics so special? Or at least one reason, because the way we're going to achieve our vision of happiness is not by bonking our neighbor on the head and disrespecting their dignity as a human being, or not acknowledging their power to consent. We're going to have to talk to them. Think about Antifa. Think about all this shit going on in our country where people go and burn shit down and just say we can do whatever we want to other people, physically harm them, right? It's all a fundamental violation. Whoever they're harming physically, it's a fundamental violation of their human dignity and their capacity to consent, because of course no one consents to be being beat up, right? And so I'm going to make you come over to my side with my 2x4 that I hit you over the head, right? You'll get your way sometimes, right? So politics is special because it respects the different points of view intrinsically by respecting the people who have them and respecting their consent. And the way you hit them over the head, quote unquote, is through persuading them and giving reasons and making your best argument. And of course, one of the problems of our America right now is we have all this propaganda coming out of the media that's designed to, it's beyond just persuasion. It's like mass indoctrination. It's like almost kind of a brainwashing, which almost goes against your notion of consent, because anyone who disagrees with them is vilified, right?
Right.
Instead of saying, and the real position, if you actually believe in free speech, you have to say, I respect your right to disagree with me. And because of that, I'm going to try to make my best argument to you as to why you should actually agree with me. And of course, that doesn't always happen, even in the best of circumstances, for obvious reasons, because people want to win, right? One thing you discover when you learn about the Greeks is that politics was a great stage of competition, just like it is for us. And we have political parties, each one of them wants to win, or the elite. I guess we have political parties. They're both the same. They're elites and we're the little guy and they want to beat us. That's kind of the narrative that's emerged over the last so many years. And the little people are trying to fight back the best they can. All righty. So we've stayed a little bit over, and I thank you all for hanging in there. And questions, thoughts, comments before we go? Any business questions?
No, I'm good on this end.
Okay, great. So y'all have a great night.
Good night.
I hope this was good, and I'll see you
Great.
next week.
Good night.
And yes,
Professor,
I will get next week's assignment up ASAP.
Professor, before you leave,
Can
real
I
quick.
talk to you?
Nefertiti, you need to chat?
A real 2-minute chat.
Okay, and who else needs to?
Me after her. She can speak first.
Okay, Dylan.
Yes.
Nefertiti, do you need some privacy or?
Not really. Dylan can listen. It's not. I don't think it's privacy. I just want to let you know.
Wait a second. Let me do this. Let me turn off the recording because.
Okay.